Chief Executive of New Philanthropy Capital. Please welcome Dan Corry.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to check the clicker. There's my clicker. Great pleasure to be here and to be working with HLF. It's a beautiful space. I've only been in here in this venue before when it's been a sort of lecture, which was not nearly as nice as this kind of feel. What I'm going to do this morning is to talk through some work we did at MPC for Heritage Lottery Fund, focused around finance. But I'm also going to go a bit wider and hopefully set you up well for the rest of the day. I'm sure I'll provoke you at least a bit. Just to tell you a little bit about what MPC is so you understand where we're coming from. We are a charity and we work as a consultancy and a think tank, and we're all about trying to improve the impact of the not-for-profit sector, which means knowing about the impact you create, trying to improve, working with your sector to try and share what works, and innovating, which of course includes finance, which is going to be what I'm going to talk about most. And just to click through a rather dynamic slide, since we started off with a very good presentation, we work with charities, with the funders of charities, and with the sector as a whole. With charities, we help them try to understand what they're trying to achieve and how to get a handle on what they are achieving, what their impact is. Rather similar with funders, although that goes across to commissioners as well. And with the sector, we try and bring funders and those receiving funding together. It's a relationship which in the non-profit sector doesn't work very well. And we try and bring them all together on the basis that's how you create change and innovation. So that's what we're all about. Now, what is the heritage sector actually trying to do? And as with any issue, we have to start with that question. What does success look like? Are we just trying to preserve assets? Is the building the aim, or is it more than that? What about the social and cultural role that heritage can play, particularly at a time of great economic upheaval and technological change? This chart here that I put up is actually what the HLF asked for people to show in terms of outcomes, and it's, as you can see, it's around heritage issues, around individuals, things like attitudes and skills, and around communities. And I think it's very useful, it's a step forward, and it's a lot more than you see from a lot of funders, but I would say it's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear with my slides working, actually, but it's not entirely clear if these are precise enough, and a lot of them are outputs, not outcomes. But nevertheless, so we start with some idea of what the sector's trying to do. What are the issues that you're all facing at the minute, particularly on the funding side? I think, obviously, we all know the sector has lost substantial government funding over the last 4 years, and it's unlikely to come back fast. And the question, in a sense, is can you access finance elsewhere? And we were asked to look at this issue from the heritage organisation side and also from the potential providers of alternative finance. The work was done mainly by my colleagues Abigail Rothrow and Lindsay Hodgson. And how did we go about trying to get a handle on this issue? Well, what we did was a survey of HLF grantees. And it's a big database, about 3,000 contacts on it. And the response rate we got was around 1,000, which for a survey like this is pretty exceptional, actually. And as you can see from the chart, to give you a feel about, in a sense, who we are now analysing, the majority, 64%, came from the voluntary sector, 12% from the local authorities, and there's a variety of others. So that's kind of now what I'm going to talk about, what we found when we asked them these questions. And what did we find? Well, first of all, where do heritage organisations get their money at the moment? What the chart shows is the proportion of organisations against their largest source of income. So, for instance, it shows that for 21% of organisations, they said that government grants were their largest source of income. And as you can see, there is a heavy reliance on grants. 60% of heritage organisations overall report that grants are their largest source of income. And you can see the breakdown between grants from government and from other organisations. Another couple of interesting things to say about this. Earned income actually plays quite an important role, 17% saying that that was their biggest source of income, although the question will be hanging there, and I'll come back to it, could that be more? Only 13% have donations as their largest source of income. There's a potential to increase that. And you'll see, if you've got good eyesight, that borrowing is rarely the major source, although overall, other data from NCVO suggests that borrowing in the sector, this is by looking at debt ratios and so on, is rather similar to what it is in the rest of the voluntary sector. And you'll see that contracts are rarely, in this sector, the most important source of funding. So that's where people are getting their money at the moment. Looking across time, what's been happening to income? Let's have a look. Come on. And what you can see from this chart, what it shows is the four biggest categories in terms of the largest source of income. So that's donations, earned income, government grants, and grants from other organisations. And as you can see, amongst those where government grants were the most important, 82 in our survey, which is almost 45%, have seen a decrease in their overall income. So that quite clearly shows where the pinch point is, and I'm sure heritage organisations would echo that. It seems to match what we instinctively think. But it is important, I think, to put it in context, because we also asked in the survey, how are you doing? How's it been over the last few years? And perhaps surprisingly, 73% of organisations reported that over the last 3 years their income has stayed the same or increased. And only 20% said it had decreased. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you that, that funding has sort of gone up, because it could be those that have lost a lot more than those who have gained. But nevertheless, I think it is an interesting sort of reality check. Perhaps suggests the sector's been doing pretty well to try and keep its income up. There's, of course, an issue about what's going to happen in the next 3 or 4 years, and I think most people predict that things, particularly from the government side, can only get tighter. When thinking about what the options, therefore, of accessing different kinds of finance, given that grant funding, particularly from government, seems less likely to be around, it's important to understand what the heritage organisations have, as it were. And one of the things I want to say first is that what heritage organisations have that lots of others don't have is assets. Around 60% of organisations own a physical heritage asset. That's mainly buildings and collections, although land, as you can see there, is important as well. So that's an important factor to bear in mind. And another thing that they have, which is not often thought about as an asset, is access to volunteers. Often it's seen as a weakness in organisations. They rely on volunteers, but of course it's also a strength. And what you can see here, on the right-hand side of the graph, what it's showing us that only 3% of heritage organisations have no volunteers, and it's, almost 70% have between 5 and 100 volunteers. In contrast, on the left-hand side, where we're looking at paid staff, around a third of organisations have no paid staff at all, and another third have 1 to 5 paid staff. But that volunteering sort of heaviness is something I'll come back to. We looked at different types of non-grant finance, and you can split this in different ways, but the usual way of that people think about it is to think about debt finance, which essentially is loans, equity finance, and alternative finance, some of the new things coming along like crowdfunding. We also asked people why they were looking for non-grant finance. What were they going to spend it on if they got it? And in many ways, it was just the classic thing you'd always think that people would ask for finance for this kind of thing. Developing existing businesses, refurbishment, capacity building, rather similar to what you get if you asked for-profit organisations as well. So nothing kind of totally surprising there. However, when we looked at how interested people were and what they were doing, we came up with this kind of pyramid feel of what's happening in the sector at the minute. Four main groups, if you like. So the active, the little bit at the top, which shows basically that few people are actually using non-grant finance. There are more people who are showing interest in using it, even if they're not using it so far. There's even more who are sort of unaware about even of the possibilities of using debt finance, let alone some of the other things that are around. And there's a big chunk as well who just think it's just kind of irrelevant. Why are you asking me this question? So there is an argument that says that where we need to get to, perhaps, is to sort of change the shape of that pyramid. So there's more up the top and a bit less down the bottom. We unpick this a little bit. trying to look at knowledge, experience, and appetite for non-grant funding. In terms of use, which is the light orange bit right at the top, which you probably can't see, but actually I thought that there's quite a lot there using debt. It's 12% using debt finance, much less on the other two, on equity and alternative. If you then look at interest in the area, which is the darker orange, you do start to find quite a lot of interest, particularly in alternative sources. A lot of people seem to be interested in crowdfunding, and I'll say whether that's sensible or not in a minute. But most, which is the shades of purple or mauve or whatever it is, have not interested, never heard of these products. So why is this? Why aren't they interested in it? And we asked them that question. And the main reasons are they feel there are issues to do with mission suitability, relevance, and eligibility. Of course, this is partly due to ignorance, and if they knew more, they might realize that some of those were not the barriers that they think they are. But I would notice as well that certainly we find in MPC and a lot of work we do with the charity sector as a whole, there's always an opposite danger here. We've got lots of charities coming to us saying they want to have loan finance or all sorts of interesting finance, and we spend a long time convincing them that they're completely mad, they couldn't cope with the risk, they haven't got a revenue stream, and so on. So you've got to be sensible in this, and maybe heritage organisations are more sensible than most. Where did the non-grant finance come from for those who are using non-grant finance? It essentially comes from the mainstream banks and charitable foundations. In other words, it's highly traditional, sort of sensible, given the structure of heritage organisations, maybe surprisingly little, given the asset base, which is attractive often to lenders, even if it's not always realisable. Why so little is accessed, worry about ability to pay back and the complexity. And as you can see, the bits up the top, which are, if you like, the newer, innovative, sexy kind of forms of alternative finance, there's not actually much happening there. So, as ever, those new bits much talked about, not much used. But people are starting to use these things. Particularly, we picked up a lot of interest, at least in the idea, of crowdfunding. This is an example of dig ventures that run archaeological digs and are using crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, as people often think it's just some kind of sort of free charitable funding that comes in a different way. It isn't, as this case study revealed. And for instance, in this case, there's all sorts of things you get if you put a certain amount of money in. You get to turn up to digs or whatever. And you always get examples of that in crowdfunding. So it's not many are using it. It is complicated. We're learning exactly what it can do and what it can't do. And it's certainly not a substitute for simple charitable donation. Another area that people are getting interested in, although again there's not that much happening, is community shares. And this is a chart showing them growing. It looks dramatic, but that's basically because it starts from zero. So there's not many of them, but at least it is growing. There's issues about who can actually issue shares, and traditional charities can't, so you have to have the right legal form. In some cases, community shares are about cementing community ownership as much as they are about funding. But they can provide leverage to raise funds from elsewhere through providing long-term risk capital and also demonstrating community support for projects to funders. To date, most of these have been shops, pubs, and in energy, but there have been some in the heritage sector, and the one that people tend to talk about is Hastings Pier, with community shares being an important part, not least in showing local people are behind the project. Another form of alternative finance that there's some interest in really is trying to think through whether you can get an income stream from what you're doing. On the right-hand side, you'll see things that are very difficult to get payment for, so views or cultural meaning and so on. On the left-hand side, it's where you can see that it is possible to get a revenue stream, paid visitors or power generation from forestry, for instance. And there is a question about whether we can shift, if you like, some more of the right-hand side to the left-hand side, and whether we can do more on the left-hand side. People think energy production through hydro and wind is a sort of established area, whether there's more potential in the water sector in particular, and in the forestry sector. So this is kind of if aiming, I think, what tends to be called in this area as paired profit benefit. I think in the rest of the voluntary sector, it's more called about as social enterprise. In other words, you're trying to basically be a social organisation, but pay your own way. An example, just to show these things really are happening, is the Woodland Trust, who are doing some work in this area. And of course, what you also have to do is you have to put all these different bits of finance together. It's rarely that you're just going to do one of these. And the Tidal Building Preservation Trust, an example of using grants, loans, and equity and community in the form of community shares to try and move things on. Just an interesting aside on this one. One of the things that they found, and I think one needs to think through, is community shares are great for some funders, but they do put off private developers. They worry a great deal about what these community shares mean for ownership structure and liquidity and so forth. So just a few more slides where we're just flipping round to what the social investors, the people who heritage organisations might want to lend them some money, what do they think about all this? And we interviewed, here we didn't do a big survey, but we interviewed the likes of ESME, Trust Venturesome, Charity Bank, and so on. And of course, social investors come in very different shapes and sizes. Those interested a lot in social impact can see an opportunity in the heritage sector, but they worry about mission, they worry about impact, and they worry about business models and risk. Heritage projects, rightly or wrongly, are seen by them as low impact and high risk. They regard heritage organisations as not good at measuring their social impact. And a lot of the investors want to see heritage assets as a means to an end, not the end of it in itself. And that obviously is a challenge to heritage organisations who, if you like, see their mission very much in a pure heritage kind of way. So there's potential here, but there are certain worries. And you have this sort of mismatch that it seems to be between what heritage organisations think and what the investors think. Now, this may be because heritage organisations are not communicating and measuring their impact in the same language as social investors. The graph shows that of course, there will be some heritage projects which are, if you like, pure heritage, and some which are social purpose created through heritage. And of course, there will be a spectrum. But in practice, perhaps we should, be pushing a bit harder on this, because as I showed before, almost all heritage projects and organisations are using volunteers, and volunteers are creating lots of social outcomes, and maybe the sector just isn't talking enough about that. So even when something seems pure heritage, there will still be social outcomes that perhaps you can get funded. The kind of outcomes people are looking for are very varied. This is actually a slide based on some work we did for the Arts Council, but it's be very similar in the heritage sector. So people are looking for outcomes, investors looking at outcomes in the place and inclusion area, things like regeneration, community cohesion, in life skills, things like routes into employment and social skills, and health and well-being, physical health, identity, socialization, isolation, and so forth. So that's what they're looking for. A tricky issue is to do with the social impact of what heritage organisations do. Is that I've said that we found social investors think heritage organisations are not good at measuring social outcomes. That is not what heritage organisations think. When asked, 61% of them say they're good or very good at measuring outcomes, and only 5% rate themselves as poor. Quite interestingly, you have to query this slightly. On the left-hand side, the purple shows those who think they were good or very good at various things. You might gasp that they all think they're fantastic at business planning, finance, and so forth. But if you then look to the right-hand side, when they're asked, are they any good at things like measuring social impact, they agree that they're not. So it's slightly weird. And then when we asked a little bit more about how do they try and measure their social impact, what they said was essentially, and I'm going to be a bit nasty here, but they're doing a lot of surveys and questionnaires. They're collecting a lot of data, mainly on outputs. And they're collecting a lot of case studies. And being nasty about that, that's about surveys, outputs, and anecdotes, rather than actually getting any real handle on the social impact that you're having. Finally, we asked heritage organisations, what could HLF do for you? So here's an issue, the problem, you want to access this finance. What could they do to help? And interestingly, rather than sort of saying they should somehow be the kind of introducers to finance people or set up funds or whatever, it was mainly about skills, help with skills and advice on these kind of things. So that's what they were asking for. It'll be interesting to hear what HLF think themselves. So in conclusion, I'm discovering I have to press this twice to move once. That non-grant finance will be right for some organisations and will improve their sustainability, and there are lots of opportunities to diversify funding. So that's kind of optimistic. There is a surprising low level of interest, I would say. Seems to be mainly due to a lack of understanding and awareness of non-grant finance, perhaps conservatism in terms of borrowing from trustees and others, something we find generally in the charity sector, slightly due to the governance that we have to obey in the sector. There's interest in things like crowdfunding, although it's probably not well understood, and exactly what it is and what the risks are. And we've got to do something about this perception gap between the potential investors and the sector. And we need to build more knowledge around non-grant finance. Just very last thoughts. I think from the sector, one can just sort of say it's terribly unfair that government grant funding has gone away and try and campaign. One can just hope that perhaps it will come back again, perhaps austerity will end, and the first choice for government money will be the heritage sector. Seems a little unlikely to me. But if the sector wants to access different forms of finance, and I think there's all sorts of opportunities out there, I think we really have to think hard about how we do that and emotionally buy into the idea that there are other forms of finance and we can go out and get them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. Dan will be back up on the stage in a few minutes to respond to your questions as part of a panel.